I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange. Hey there, spooky nerds, and welcome to Talking Strange, the paranormal pop culture show. I'm Aaron Sagers, and today we are we're doing this live through the Patreon live stream function, but we're also, you guys can all listen to it here after the fact, where you can join live. That's up to you. But aside from that, my guest tonight is the author of multiple books, including what we're going to be talking about this evening, American Spirits, which is the true story of the celebrity sisters, no other way to put it, Maggie, Kate, and Leah Fox, creators of the Spiritualism movement, creators of the seance, and this book, it's set in the just about 20 years leading up to the Civil War. It is a nonfiction story for, it's marketed as mystery-loving teens. However, I think that as someone that's read a lot about the Fox sisters, I think it actually is, it's probably the best presentation of the Fox sister story that I have ever read. I happen to really enjoy it. It's a really, quite honestly, a real life ghost story. And it involves truths, complicated relationships, lies, maybe lies, and I guess truths that we tell ourselves and how we tell those truths to ourselves. And the other book, so that is American Spirits. And the other book is, that we'll be getting to, is Houdini's Library, which this is the right side up, and it keeps confusing me, about, it's really a picture book about the biography and a backstory about the iconic illusionist Harry Houdini, who was not only, still is, I think, the most famous magician or illusionist of all time, but who is an avid book collector. So let me also tell you a little bit more about the guest. Her name's Barb Rosenstock, and according to her bio, she likes true stories about real people. She's the author of nonfiction and historical fiction children's books that combine deep research and playful language to bring history to life. And her book, The Noisy Paint Box, which was illustrated by Mary Grandpré, received a Caldecott honor, and other works include, multiple other works, including the Orbis Pictus Honor, a Sidney Taylor Honor, and the California Library Association Betty Award, as well as numerous national and state recognitions. And let's get into it. Barb, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for asking me. I love talking about my spooky sisters.
Yeah. So, and again, without exaggeration, I do have to say that this, what I loved about the book is there's so much history to cover about the Fox sisters. And it's one of those topics that for people that are into the spooky material know, we think we know a lot about these women. And you just lay so much out there, and you're presenting it in such a way that you're being carried along with this story. There's a lot of revelations that I was not aware of. It's just so readable. I was eating it up the whole way, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it. So to kick things off, what was your draw to the topic of the Fox sisters? Because you were working on this book for at least 5 years, yes?
Yeah. And it's not really a picture book. Typically, I write for much younger readers, and this story just got a hold of me. What happened is I literally in some bookshop somewhere found a book on Lilydale, the famous, camp town, the town where people talk to the dead, and just read through it. I don't know. I tend to pick up sometimes I just pick up stuff that looks cool to me. So I read about Lilydale, and the Fox sisters have a very small part in that. And I kind of just put it in the back of my head somewhere and thought, I wonder if you could write a picture book about three spooky sisters, but probably not. So not so much a third grade topic. And so I just kind of just put it in the back of my head. And then I was in New York, in upstate New York, working on another picture book for research. And those like tacky pamphlet racks that are inside of a hotel, like a
Yeah.
roadside hotel. Well, there was this pamphlet rack, and one of the pamphlets said, "Birthplace of Spiritualism. Go see the Fox sisters." Like cottage site in Hydesville, which was not too far, probably about 2 hours from where I was. And I had a half a day. I hopped in a car. I drove to the site of their initial cottage, which is in the middle of very rural New York, even today, and then saw how young they were. There was a picture there that I thought, wow, these were teenagers. And I just kind of remember sitting there in that field, um, with the replica of their cottage, which is now there, and just thinking, remember doing seances? Remember like talking to Mary Worth in the mirror? Remember trying to levitate people? How cool that what we think of as a seance in the States anyway was like invented, and it was invented by two teenage women.
Yeah.
And something about that, just like, wow, like what did it take to do that? Why did they do that? Just the questions just started, they wouldn't let go of me. So I started reading about the Fox sisters. There's a lot about them, but it's in a lot of different places. So it has to be really pieced together to do something narrative like this. The information came from everywhere. So yeah, that's kind of what happened. I'm not like a horror movie kind of fan and stuff like that, but I like spooky stuff. And this just got a hold of me as a story.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
the cottage itself is now in Lilydale, right? Or it's been a number of years since I've been in Lilydale, but they have their own kind of tribute to the Fox sisters there.
Right. They have a tribute on the actual physical cottage was moved there. I don't remember when, somewhere in the 50s, maybe 40s. Then it burned down.
Oh, right, yeah.
So yeah, no, there's a picture in the book on in the right at the beginning of the book of the very, I mean, to call it a cottage is an exaggeration in a lot of ways. I mean, it looks more like what you would call a shed, and that is where they lived with their parents when this whole first contact with this spirit of the peddler happened. So,
Right.
yeah.
And briefly break down, well, okay, so the story is, we have Maggie and Kate, they're living with their parents, and then there's this mysterious knocking that begins right around is it April? It's March 31st,
It's March 31st,
1848.
1848. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So and then they proceed to go live with their sister, Leah, and then known as Leah Fish, previously Fox. And then we have essentially the beginning of this celebrity movement. But before we get to that, break down kind of these three young girls and woman in the form of Leah. Just if you were going to give like a short biographical profile, a psychographic of this person, of these different girls, how
Hmm.
would you describe each of them?
All right, easiest to start with Leah. There's probably the most information about her. Leah is one of the oldest of actually, she is the oldest of the Fox children. She is at least 20 years older than the two younger sisters, Kate and Maggie, that we're talking about, who become the first mediums in the United States, anyway. Leah was a young wife, 14, 15 years old, a young mother before she was 16, 17 years old, and then was abandoned. So by her husband, and actually in a time when women could do very little for themselves in very many ways, she managed to make a living as a single mother away from her family. She was in Rochester, New York. Her family was in Hydesville, which is quite a ways away. In those days, even farther away. And she was a piano teacher. She raised a daughter, Lizzie, who was her daughter. And until this mysterious rapping began to start, that was her life. She made really good friends. She was known as a respectable woman, which was really hard to do when you didn't have a male partner at that point. And so that's kind of Leah. She's out there. She's already a grown woman. She's got a daughter. She's already been through a couple of lives, and she's up there living in Rochester. Her sister Maggie is 14 at the time of the rappings. And Maggie was known as probably the most beautiful one. That was an important thing for her to be. Very ladylike, retiring, but there was a sense of humor about Maggie. There was something about Maggie that when people met the three girls together, they're like, ooh, let's pay attention to that one. So there was something about Maggie Fox, and no one really has put their, since I'm a nonfiction writer, I don't really kind of make things up. I can't really put my finger on that. The best word that I found in all the information is irrepressible. There was something like just about her spirit. Her younger sister, Kate, was much more of a retiring person, seemed much more spiritual in whatever, kind of stereotypical ways we think of that, like much more, retiring and maybe a little bit more staring out in the space all the time, and seemed a little bit more in contact with whatever the, woo-woo type spirit stuff was. The girls, the two younger girls were literally until the time of the knocking, there was nothing unusual about them. There's been no evidence that, anyone in the town thought they were, strange or unusual or smarter than normal or not smarter than normal or, just anything other than two typical rural 1840s-ish young women.
Yeah, and in the
Yeah.
book you talk about the early moments that one of the neighbors, knew them to be a pleasant enough family. The girls were playful, maybe a little mischievous, but nothing bad. Like they
No,
had a
no, just
totally fine reputation.
right. Totally fine reputation. Even the sister being married, the oldest sister being married and a single, I mean, a mother, it didn't seem to like her reputation. There was nothing, they were very ladylike. They stuck to those social norms of the time. And yeah,
Yeah.
they're very typical family for
And
their time.
and these rappings that began in 1848, and I misspoke because I guess like it wasn't about 20 years, it was only about 13 years before the Civil War, I guess. But quickly starts spiraling or escalating to the point that they go to move with Leah, live with Leah, and then start drawing crowds by holding what was to become known as like the seance, and with these spirit rappings of this supposed peddler. Maybe they were talking to the spirit of Mr. Splitfoot. I know there's, some names that have been applied to this spirit. And then they go on to become truly celebrities of their time. Yes.
Yeah, I in my head, the story became like essential for me to write when I realized that they were like Kardashians. They were like the influencers. If, before we had mass media the way we have it now, or social media and all of the media that we have now, they really were influencers, and that idea of what happens to two or three very normal people when fame is, they do something and fame is thrust upon them in some ways. I mean, whether you can argue whether were they seeking it or not, just like we can argue whether celebrities today are seeking it or aren't, and what happens to their life, and where do they go. That became like to me just the spiritualism part of it is obviously very fascinating. I mean, you have floating instruments and floating tables and floating people and people locked in closets by spirits and people doing all kinds of things with spirits. But what was fascinating to me is what a typical like modern celebrity story it was, full of, ups and downs and manager problems and money issues and who's fighting who about who really gets the star to sit with them, and tragedies and celebrity romances. I mean, it was like a People magazine article, except it all occurred in the 1850s, so
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And it's funny you mentioned the Kardashians because going back to I don't know when I first started doing presentations about paranormal pop culture, I would talk with the Fox sisters and I would have like a slide that would kind of morph into the Kardashians, kind of
Oh,
connecting
really?
it
I
to this
didn't know
modern
that. Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
Because, but, but what was interesting is like contrast that to the Kardashians. Would you say that part of what makes these young girls famous is the fact, like the Kardashians very much have their own voice and make it known, whereas at least in the case of Maggie and Kate, and Katie, Maggie and Katie, like their voices weren't really heard so much in the public sphere. They were talked about, but not so much talked to. That contributed to the celebrity as well.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Women, well, most women, actually, almost all women, didn't speak in public, period. It was a very social, it was hard for me to wrap my head around that. Um, but it was a very social, there were not women, I mean, women on the stage meant prostitute, period. Like it just did. And so anybody that was even getting up in a church and preaching was risking reputational disaster, right? So, and then Maggie and Kate, the younger you were, the worse that was, because then you weren't already married. So you didn't have a man saying, well, that's okay. That's my wife. It's okay with me if she speaks, right? Um, Anybody who was, and Maggie at that time was 14, which is right on the cusp of you're going to become into the marriage market, right? Going on stage or speaking your mind or speaking to the public was literally kind of a social death sentence about nobody was going to want you, you know. So they kind of, I loved the line that I feel that they walked, which was, we have a skill, you know, belief or not belief aside, we have a skill. We are going to use that skill, but we are going to let our audience interpret what we're saying. We're not going to tell you what we're doing. We're going to let you, you know, all the onus of the ownership of spirits and everything was actually on the people in the room, not the Fox sisters themselves, which is just a really strange way for them to have made their way through, you know, a social, I don't even know what to call it, minefield at the time, you know, so that they could still be famous and they were still at the center of this movement, but they, because they weren't really coming right out and telling people what to think, they still got that whole ladylike reputation and they still could kind of hide behind it. It also, especially if you are a non-believer, makes it easier to for them to have, if you are someone who thinks that it was all a big, you know, scam or sham or whatever, that it was easier to fool people when you weren't out there running your mouth telling them every 5 seconds what you were actually doing. Right. So, you know, if you think about it, the more a magician talks, the easier it is to figure out what they might be doing in a
Mhm.
lot of cases. So, yeah, yeah.
The I mean, the burned over states, we're talking about this area of upstate New York. There was a lot of religious fervor taking place during this time. And yet, while there's some movements that continue rooted out of that, the success that they were experiencing in the mainstream media of that time,
Mhm.
to what do you attribute that as opposed to some of these other movements that were existing? Why do you think they popped so much? Was it simply because they claimed to be talking to spirits? Was it because these young women on stage doing this? What's your thought?
I think that there's some general things that gets people attention, and they're not any different than the ones they are now, which is, you know, a mystery, a murder at the center of it originally. That was an original, like, who killed the peddler, right? There was an original, like, thing for people to figure out. Another mystery, are these girls faking or aren't they? Number four, and a big one, I think, they were beautiful. There were three very attractive young women um, who, you know, people like to look at. I'm assuming in real life. Too bad we don't have a lot of pictures. We don't have hardly any pictures of them. I think there's two. But you know, people really talk about how much, you know, especially rooms of gentlemen liked to be in their company, and they were, you know, they were charming, and they were, and that all helps. I mean, you know, a ghost story, pretty girls, a mystery. You could write that story tomorrow, and I bet you could sell it 50 places, you
And
know.
I was just trying to find there's the famous kind of sketch of all three of them, which doesn't really make them appear all that attractive, but then there's some other
Yes.
images that sell. Yeah, well,
This,
that there's that one, and then there's the sketch of all three of them, but the not the photograph, but I guess it's this one. This is a
yeah,
pretty famous one,
yeah.
but out of this, you don't really get much of a sense of them being these lovely women, but you do very much talk about that in the book, and then we see some other images as well. So, and I guess with these seances, it also allowed these men, the kind of the more closed room seances, allowed the men to hold the hands of these lovely young women in the dark. Scandalous,
Scandalous.
right? Um,
Scandalous. People were touching knees. Scandalous.
and they were also filling auditoriums and making money and
Absolutely.
gaining
Lots
this,
of money.
yeah, gaining this level of fame, pretty much managed by the eldest sister, Leah.
Yes.
So, in the course of the book, and let me throw it out there for anyone that's in the live audience, if you have questions, if I'm moving too fast throughout the Fox mythology and you want me to back up and explain something or pose a question, let me know. But the throughout the course of the book, it almost seems like at times Leah, who is very much running the show as far as where to go do tours, who's being sent where, because the girls were split up multiple times, and collecting the money and all of these things, and also really uh, telling the story of this emerging spiritualist movement that was catching hold. Um, is Leah a villain,
Um,
or
I,
how do you frame Leah?
yeah. In she was I would say she was a villain to her sisters. She a villain overall? I'm not so sure. I think she did what she had to do to survive, and she did what she had to do to make the life for herself that she really wanted. Now, I think her sisters were collateral damage. So in that way, yes, she was a villain. Do I um had her sisters been potentially a little stronger, a little older, a little different, I'm not sure that at all would have played out the same way, but that's just like life. I don't really, I think of her as someone who was, um, yeah, she was running a business, just, and there are a lot of tough businessmen and or tough business people in the world. And if you weren't giving her as an employee what she wanted, she wasn't that happy with you. That story about her daughter, though, that killed me when I found that story.
Yeah, talk a
Um,
little bit about Lizzie
yeah.
and that
So
relationship.
Leah had a daughter, Lizzie, the same daughter I was speaking about early on, that she'd raised as a baby. The father was abandoned, had abandoned both of them. Lizzie and Leah seem to have had a perfectly friendly, warm, loving mother-child relationship. Lizzie was very good friends with Maggie and Kate. She was about only 5 years older, so she was like kind of the three girls kind of grew up together. Um, and what wound up happening is when the wrappings started, and then it kind of was building and building. Lizzie expressed doubts publicly, and by publicly, obviously, I don't mean in the newspaper, but to a number of people and at a number of seances. One in particular, which is written about in the book. She said, "Hey, like basically, I'm not sure. Like, you sure this is spirits rapping? I don't know." And she said that when some, the religious people and other influencers in Rochester were in the room, and her mother winds up sending her away, like literally almost overnight, packs her up. Um, I don't even want to humiliates her. I mean, there's that scene that you read that when I found that, and there was actually that entire back and forth. It was heartbreaking. She humiliated her in front of a séance, saying, you're wrong, you've grieved the spirit. I mean, without saying you're going to hell. I mean, she kind of came as close as she could come. And then the next day, put her on in a coach and sent her off to her father in Illinois, who she'd never basically ever seen. And Lizzie disappears from the story for years and years. And the idea that Leah was willing to do that, I mean, now you're talking me into she is a villain. You're talking me into my own story. I tried really hard when I was writing this to be in their lives. I know that sounds kind of corny, but it's true. Where I wasn't trying to say like who's the villain and who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, but just like what's really happening? What is it like to be a young woman having this happening to you in these times? And kind of take it from there. But I kind of just talked myself into, yeah, she's a villain.
I mean, she was also a survivor. Like that's the
She's
thing
a
about Leah.
survivor.
Like that this woman that, as you said, grew up in a time when she couldn't vote, couldn't own land. Everything was hinged on even the kids, even Lizzie technically belonged to the father. Like, and it wasn't easy. It was near impossible for a woman to make much of a living on her own. Not only did she go from seeing the opportunity of teaching piano to saying, "Oh, there's something here business wise that I can make hay with,"
Right.
and pretty much continued to do that. She had some struggles throughout the years, but she pretty much was always coming out on top.
Absolutely. Absolutely. She was for sure financially, and I would even say in terms of emotional happiness, the most successful of the three
Yeah.
when you look at their entire lives. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and similar to modern celebrity stories, meanwhile, we have similar to modern celebrity stories, we also have the clashing and the breakups and the reunions and but meanwhile, Lee and Maggie or Maggie and Kate end up kind of these are young girls. They're experiencing this extravagance. They're experiencing a lifestyle that is totally oppositional to anything they grew up with, and weren't very educated, worldly young girls. Now people are not only giving them all this adoration, but also feeding them booze that they were not really prepared to handle. So we have this sort of, not sort of, this very tragic temptation of alcohol that comes to dominate their life. It seems like there were characters that were trying to intervene and help these girls. Why do you think that they continue to spiral so much? Was it that there was never really as much oversight as they needed,
Yeah.
or there was more need for them to keep delivering?
I think in any, I mean, I think you hit it on the head right at the beginning when you said it's a common celebrity story, right? If you have to keep performing every day, there's a lot of times people will use substances in lots of different substances to make sure that they can, get on the stage the next night, go to the next city, get on the next stage. I mean, that is exhausting. And most regular human beings not on substances would have a very hard time doing it for long periods of time. So, and that's not to say everyone's an addict or, but it's certainly not uncommon. What I found so fascinating about the there's a book that I kind of like. It's kind of like a secret book. It's not a secret book, but it's called the Fox Taylor Record, and it's old, very old, written by Dr. Taylor, who was the rehab doctor, who was literally Maggie and Kate's rehab doctor, trying to get them off of alcohol with all good intentions. He ran a clinic, well-known clinic. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a friend. I mean, like he was, kind of upper echelons of New York. He was the Betty Ford Clinic of 1856 or whatever it was. And, but Dr. Taylor and his wife had a couple of tragic losses of children. So while he was treating Maggie and Kate, as Kate especially, he was also asking her to perform seances to talk to their own children. So it's that classic, it's just that classic conflict of interest. I mean,
Hmm.
so you have a doctor, but the doctor's also wanting something from his client. And I just, at some point, I really remember getting to about three-quarters through writing of the book and thought, I don't, as these girls don't know if they're coming or going. And I thought that's actually a really valid emotional response on my part, like they don't know. They don't know who wants what from them at any one time. Is that my friend or is that my rehab doctor or is that somebody who I'm supposed to talk to their dead child about? Is that my friend or is that someone who's going to write about me in the paper tomorrow and gossip about me in the paper tomorrow, and again, such a modern celebrity story. Like where, when you're that famous, and believe it or not, in those days, they were that famous, everyone, no one, if you would have said the Rochester knockings anywhere in the country between 1848 and 1860, every single human being ish would have known what you were talking about and who you were talking about.
Yeah.
So, when you don't know if you're coming or going, it is really hard to keep an addiction in check. You have to have a sense of self. And without that, I at some point, and it's certainly in the author's note, I made a kind of a long, maybe too long, but it's author's note about, did they believe themselves? Is it possible that someone could believe have been told a story for so long, so young, that you think it's true too?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a possibility. I also kind of err, which makes me a little strange maybe, but I err on the fact that we don't know everything. Did they have spiritual abilities? I don't know. Did they confess to fake? Yeah, they did. But did they have? I don't know. There's a couple of things that initial table moving thing that I cannot figure out, and a couple of magicians that I've talked about. Like, how would you really do this in daylight? Like, could this be done in daylight by people who don't know what they're doing, right? Because at the time they were amateurs. I mean, capital A amateurs. How would you pull that off? And people are still like, is it doable? Yes, of course it's doable. But is it doable by someone who isn't a magician, has had no training? What does that mean? So I guess I always err on the, not the paranormal side of things, but the fact that we don't know the answers to everything. We never do.
Well, yeah, we can jump into that because,
Yeah.
well, first off, like the uh yeah, I mean the stories as they're in rehab, on one hand they're it was Maggie that was with the Taylors, right? And
No, Kate was with the
Kate
Taylors
Kate
longer.
with the
They were
Taylors.
both with the Taylors
Yeah,
at some point, but Kate lived there.
but
Kate lived in the rehab in their
she's
house.
trying to get dry, and meanwhile, he's getting high off of her supply, and every night having to perform to connect them with their dead kids. But the this one confounds me because I mean I'll say even before I read your book, I've never quite known where I sit with the Fox sisters because yes, the two of them recanted it, but then re-recanted it, undid the like and said, well, I was just doing that because, I they offered me money, I needed to do it. I needed to get by somehow, which is relatable. You can have a lot of sympathy for that. And yet these were these two young girls specifically that they were not super well educated, and yet the things that people reported seeing, maybe they were drumming it up to make it more theatrical, but not just the rapping, not just the table movements, but seeing forms emerge, supposedly holding hands in these closed rooms with only two sitters with them. I'm talking in the case of the Taylors, but in other instances, still pretty closed rooms. Seeing these forms emerge, being able to, with one, I mean, this is incredible by today's standards. With one hand, like writing down a spirit message, and with the other hand, writing backwards this mirror message and still doing everything else that's happening. Just like that level of fakery would be pretty impressive in
It's right.
2026, much less these two girls that didn't really come from much and were not trained to be con artists, like where do you where do you sit with that?
I don't know, Aaron. um, I sit with the fact that you have to sit with the fact that, science, I mean, again, the author's note, science has tried to prove this stuff or, test this stuff, for many, many, many years. And you can pretty much say that anytime a scientific experiment has happened, it's all been kind of like, yeah, no, no, we can't really read minds and we can't really call up the dead, and that's just not happening. And yet, um, the other one who gets me is Charles Livermore. There was a man that lost his wife, Estelle, very young. He was very
Right.
much in love with her, very much in love with her. And Kate, he calls on Kate um, to come into his home and try to get Estelle back. Now, if you are a recently widowed young person in I mean, so he was maybe 27, I want to say, somewhere in there. Okay, so he's 27 years old. He recently loses his much beloved, like I'm obsessed with her kind of beloved wife, who is beautiful, who he misses physically, emotionally, in all ways. And yet when Kate Fox holds his hand and talks to him, and then he begins seeing Estelle's spirit, he can't tell the difference. He's not there going, huh, yeah, kind of looks like a handkerchief that might be in the shape of my Estelle. The man is screaming, Estelle is back. He is trying to kiss her. He is trying to have her stroke his hair, his face. He's obsessed. Now, how does a young woman from rural New York without much of an education pull that off? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Or is there such a thing as being so, I mean, grief does weird things to people, myself
Yeah.
included. It does. It does strange. I unfortunately had a friend pass this week, this just past week, and I've even noticed it myself. I'm talking to someone who wasn't particularly religious, and I don't think is coming back, but I'm talking to them like constantly, and I'm like, what is this? Like, what is going on? Let alone someone who is missing their primary relationship and has a way to communicate when that's all they've wanted for months. It's I mean, this story had, to me, it had everything. There was romance, there was tragedy. It's like a miniseries. It was like a super dramatic gothic miniseries in my head.
Yeah.
Um, and I hope I did it justice. I don't know.
I mean,
But
again,
it's,
I
you
think
know,
it's I think you did a great job presenting
yeah,
the story in ways that, I hadn't really thought about and putting it all together because we are going along in the story as it unfolds.
right,
It's definitely very narrative. And I mean, this is the things I know. And I'm deeply sorry about your loss. And grief does do strange things to people. And so does belief, and belief to the point that you, um, you start doing mental gymnastics to explain away things that maybe you could easily explain. And I also know that, I've interacted with people who say their child is sensitive or a medium or whatever, and they drum that into them, or that your kid is super talented and can achieve anything, and the kid either believes it or needs to start filling that role to appease the parent, to be the kid that the parent wants. So I get that, and that's complicated. And then even with science, the those that would show up to debunk again are probably not paying much attention to these young girls, because how could a girl pull this off? Just a simple girl, like that dismissive approach. And yet I also kind of lean on this thing of like, in these instances, proving it's about proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Like, so, but they couldn't do that. I mean, granted, they didn't necessarily have 2026 scientific skills, but they still were in the room groping these girls literally at times and trying to figure it out, and they still couldn't figure it out. I mean, hell, even Barb, like, even just the straight up admission of, well, from a young age, we managed to master the bones and the muscles and our legs. That alone just seems near impossible to me, to make these level of pops that were so loud that people started believing they were hearing it coming, emanating from all corners of the room and
not
quite
like that, like
loud.
32 in a row. Can
Yeah.
you crack your knuckles 32 times in a row in a rhythmic pattern? I mean, like, I'm not sure anybody can.
Without moving
Right,
in a perceptible manner,
right.
all pretty much coming from their knees down.
Yes.
This is the kind of thing that I just struggle with this story, because I'm not saying that I believe them and they weren't faking, but but I weirdly can't dismiss based on the accounts how crazy it gets and people reporting it. And these weren't people just trying to sell spiritualism.
No, no, they were not. No, they were not. There was both skeptic. I mean, they turned a lot of skeptics into believers. They turned some, they almost no believers turned into skeptics. I mean, mostly there was skeptics who came in and, I, I just I'm astonished by them. I'm still astonished by them. I'm astonished by um just the scope of their lives and the times that they lived in,
Yeah.
because in as all of the spiritual and the, as death is kind of like marching through the country too. I mean, cholera before the Civil War, and then cholera during the Civil War, and then cholera after the Civil War, let alone the regular measles and diphtheria and, all the other stuff that's going around. And that the statistic, 50% of kids didn't live to be 5 years old. So that means basically anyone who had a child lost at least one, if not multiples. And just what did that do to our cult, to our society? Like, what was it like to live in the United States when that was happening? And as I was writing this, it was obviously COVID. And that was really interesting too, because I'm like, this is very modern. It's
Yeah.
very modern. Do we reach for belief only in times of tragedy? Does belief need tragedy? Kind of like all those like kind of weird, esoteric kind of questions. It's like, does belief only come out of tragedy? Do we only say, hey, is there something beyond us when we're sad? Yeah, all of that, came into their story. And I just found it. I was trying to say something about our times in this book too, about to young adults. I mean, anybody like teenage and up, basically, about what happens when you tell yourself a lie, and we all have. I think we all have. I mean, we all have. Maybe not this big of one, but we've all told ourselves lies. What does that do to you if you really repeat that to yourself over and over and over time? How much did you really change because of your own untruths? And just, what's the truth? That whole, truth and, whether is truth social, really truth or social, like all of that stuff, I wanted kids to think through that. I wanted young people and anybody who wrote the book to think through that themselves. Like, what is the truth really?
I
Did we just manufacture it? Can we all manufacture it, and then how do you meet? I mean, that whole romance that happens between Maggie and Elisha Kent Kane, again, another very famous celebrity. Probably the most famous man in America at that time, was engaged or not, or again, whatever you want to believe.
yeah,
um,
I want to get into Elisha
Maggie.
because this is
Yeah,
a story about these sisters, but you do such an excellent job of talking about Elisha Kane, and I admittedly I knew who Elijah Kane was, but I always very much thought of him as more of a kind of a footnote in this story, like having influence over the story, but let's face it, like I don't. I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone walking down the street who knows who Elijah Kane is. And maybe there'd be a
right.
lot of people who know the Fox sisters were, but you're going to hit on someone that knows the Fox sisters before Elijah Kane.
I think so.
So just for folks like, tell us a little bit why Elijah Kane was this celebrity and just, briefly overall, like what his role was in this whole story.
Well, Arctic exploration at the time was like being an astronaut in the 1960s. It was something the whole world was doing. We were trying to, especially in England and the States, some Canadians, some Norwegians, but there was a very famous explorer last name Franklin who got lost in the Arctic somewhere. And there were a number of expeditions that went to go find him. Elisha Kane was on one of the ones from America, the Grinnell, called the Grinnell expedition. He went up, he tried to find Franklin. They were not successful, but the whole entire process of exploring the Arctic was in the newspapers like constantly, like the way that, Neil Armstrong was in the newspaper, was on the TV constantly when I was a little kid. These were just the guys to look up to. They were out there doing something that was impossible. They were living at 40 below zero, wearing what seemed to me like a coat and a pair of gloves from the dollar store. When you see what they were wearing, I'm like, how did they even do it? You know, it's another story of like, what story do you have to tell yourself to go live at 40 below, wearing not what we would consider now any appropriate clothing,
For a
and
couple years.
persist? You know, it's that whole idea of how much they had in common. You know, she's over there exploring what we think and how do you influence people? And he's pretty much exploring the physical side of the earth in a lot of ways. So Elijah Kane comes back. He's famous. He writes a book. It's pretty well received. He goes back out. He decides that he is going to re take a second crack at finding out what happened and hopefully look for what was called the open polar sea. People thought there was a sea kind of above Canada, for lack of an easier word, like a different sea, not the water that they're now, but like, you know, a whole big open thing that you could maybe like go right to China from there or something. Um, and of course there isn't, but I mean, Elisha Kane's expedition, that second Grinnell expedition, was front page, you know, giant type headline news for 4 years in New York City, and then and by virtue of being in New York City, across the country. So he was super famous. And Maggie Fox, he was super famous and like kind of the all-American superhero, you know, the big, the strong white man out there discovering things for America and planting the flag, you know, and he gets involved with she's talking to dead people, and where'd she come from anyway, exactly, Maggie Fox. And that whole relationship is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. This
I don't
is,
know what else to say about it without reading the whole book, but
I mean, it's fascinating because yeah, he gets wrapped up with her and he's attending seances, even though he thinks it's bunk, and talks how much about he loves her, but he also wants her to change. Uh, and he's this all-American hero. And I appreciate this about your writing style is you don't do it a whole lot. In fact, it's very well placed, but you editorialize occasionally
yeah,
and very much you highlight the fact that he's a bit of an asshole.
yeah,
He comes across as one anyhow, and and meanwhile, when you're giving us the account, because there is a kind of a solid chapter breaking down this expedition, Arctic expedition, and you're like kind of rooting for this guy. It's also kind of evocative of Frankenstein in some ways, but like it's I'm like, wow, this guy's kind of a jackass. Like but you're
he
also
is.
rooting for him.
Right. Right. He's human. You know, he's human. I mean, I really tried hard to make them all human. You
Yeah.
know, and I think that that's what we don't do, what we don't let celebrities, it doesn't allow for humanity. It really doesn't. And so I was like, these are super famous people, but what were they really like? Like, what was it like to stand next to him? You know, and Elisha, you know, he was an ass. I do editorials. I kind of actually found a lot of humor. There would have been way more in the book. That was an editor author, a number of conversations. Because at some point you are talking about death, and you know, at some point you don't want to get so jokey that you're kind of taking away from your own premise. But I really did feel the need a lot of times to be like, you know, there's a guy who writes a book and he's proud and he says, I wrote this book without any action of my mind. And I just thought, what? What did you just say? And, you know, and using him as an example of someone who perhaps got carried away with their spiritualism and was just, he's writing as Ben Franklin, but it sounds exactly like himself. He doesn't sound like Ben Franklin at all. And he's like, that's okay. I wrote this book without the action of my mind. And I thought, wow, okay. Yeah, say Elisha's mansplaining a couple of times, I think at least once. And yeah,
Yeah.
and say he's basically arrogant, an arrogant ass.
That's also kind of the thing going back a little bit about how did they manage to do this for so long, this prolonged amount of time. And granted, I mean, I'm not saying just because they were from a different time or didn't have a lot of education, they couldn't figure this stuff out, but the level of not just the true talent, being ambidextrous and writing backward, like the
Right.
true talent, much less like however the illusion or the schemes were taking place. But at that aside, we have to look at it in the context of a whole lot of other mediums that were very roundly debunked. I'm thinking like Mina Crandon here. Um, we'll get to Houdini in a second. But these other people that were by these learned men that went to examine them were debunked, you know,
Right,
but they kept it going. Uh,
right, right.
uh,
I sometimes think the smarter the skeptic, the easier it was to fool them.
huh,
Like, and I'm not sure why. I think it's also, it's hubris. You think like you said, girls. They're not. I'm a professor at Harvard. I mean, come on.
yeah.
And you can lie to yourself about your professorship to Harvard and not realize that you're as easy to fool as anybody. Um,
I think and people have heard me say this way too many times, but I actually view kind of that dogmatic belief and cynicism are two ends of the same spectrum of belief, that you can get so entrenched in one or the other that you become blinded by it.
right,
Either side of it.
right,
Everything is a ghost, nothing is a ghost,
right,
and no
right.
room for the middle ground.
Right. I kind of did think of it as left and right. I mean,
Yeah,
and almost politically at some point. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like I'm extreme over here and I'm extreme over here, and guess what? You have more in common than
yeah.
the people who are sitting in the middle. So yeah.
What were, well, this was an extreme research challenge because you're piecing from so many different things. You don't even know whether this is truly written by a person that it says it was written by. There's a lot of like speculation. With all that said, what was the largest challenge you experienced on the research side?
Where you started, who were these girls really individually? What was Maggie like that wasn't Kate? What was Kate like that wasn't Leah? That was really hard to find. Their personalities are absent for the most part. I mean, Leah wrote a book about herself.
Hmm.
Right there, that told you something about her. Um, Leah wrote a book about herself where she is the heroine of the story. And, so there's a little more about her, assuming you want to believe her. Um, but there's like nothing about Maggie and Kate Fox, really, not from their own viewpoints. At one point in the world, there was Maggie Fox had a journal that has been long lost, like long, long lost. There's just little quotes from it here and there in like from the early 1900s. And after that, no one seems to know where it went. And perhaps it never even existed. I don't know. I tried to use enough sources and sources that, again, that belief skepticism things, sources that contrasted each other. So at least you could kind of make your way through where you stood in the truth, which I really don't think is a line. I kind of think of it as a 4-lane highway.
Yeah,
Um, but that's kind of how I wound up doing it. Is just, okay, this person says this, and I don't know if I can trust them. So let's find someone who does so it says the opposite. And what are they saying? And now what was the situation? And okay, connect those three together.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah. I mean, even the longest passage we have from Maggie that's directly attributed to her. I mean, I know she wrote or she released the book of her letters with Elijah, but then we have this admission of guilt, which is very suspect in of itself, whether or not she even actually wrote all of that
yes,
based
yeah,
on the inaccuracies in it.
yes.
Um, any surprise? What was the most surprising revelation for you personally as you're coming up with this?
Oh, the fun stuff when people were talking about what at the Taylor's, people were talking about what heaven was like exactly like they were eating spiritual food, and there goes John Brown and Abe Lincoln walking down the street, and I mean how specific the communications or the visions were. Also pretty unbelievable was just the idea of spelling of people of the patience that 19th century people were used to having that we have completely lost because you and me would probably not sit in a room for 4 hours while someone spelled us 5 sentences. We
Yeah,
probably would not consider that entertainment for an evening. We would be like, whatever you're going to say, I got better places. We'd be out of there. But it was very, like just riveting. What was the next letter? And that just when you put yourself in that mindset, it's we that's when the story is really different from today.
the rap would not hold up in TikTok era,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
the
Although I saw someone do it just recently, which was really cool. A friend of mine helped with a book event, and all of a sudden, without letting me know, which was smart of him to do, he began rapping, and I don't know how he did it. And it was really, I mean, he's a magician. I know he's a magician. He's a mentalist from Chicago. And so I know it's possible, but it was really, it astonished the whole room went, what did you hear? And it was so funny because even though we were talking about it, man, it stopped people in their tracks.
uh,
Um,
it's fast. It's so
yeah.
strange to me. I mean, there's some people out there that are still pulling off the rapping trick and still have fans off of it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I know I've kept you for a bit, but
Yeah.
are you
That's,
good on time to chat about?
I
Okay,
am about
cool.
Houdini.
Yes, because meanwhile all this is happening, tragically, all three Fox sisters passed away within 3 years of one another, right?
Yes.
Leah in 90, was it Maggie in 92, and then Kate in 93, or I'm
Something like
mixing up
that. I'm
something
bad
like
at
that.
dates. I'm not
But
a date person, believe it or not.
yeah,
For writing history, I'm not a date rememberer.
but meanwhile, yeah, so between 1890 and 93, all three of them had passed away. But the meanwhile in 1874, Harry Houdini, Eric Weiss, was born in Budapest, and the world's greatest illusionist and also debunker of spiritualism or spiritualist mediums. It's interesting that they crossed over. I mean, I was already aware that they crossed over, but since I had already just read your one book and then went straight to Houdini's library, I was thinking about it in a little bit more present sense. What what kind of was the inspiration for you to dive into Harry Houdini and his love of books first and foremost?
Well, I know it's going to sound unbelievable, but this book has absolutely nothing in my head to do with this book because the idea for this book has been sitting in my head much longer than the Fox sisters, long long ago in 20, let me think, 10, 11, 12, 10, 2012. I was at the Library of Congress doing some research, and I was walking in the stacks with a guide, and I saw this little tag that said Harry Houdini collection. And I wrote a note. Harry Houdini collection, question mark. What is that? Went on, did my other work, had nothing to do with it, didn't ever think about it again, really, until I read The Witch of Lime Street, which I know, I'm assuming that you've read,
Yeah.
about Mina Crandon, years, whatever, a couple years later. And I thought, wow, okay, Houdini and spiritualism, that's really cool. But then I kind of put that aside. That's not really, again, that's not a picture book for young kids. And I was then looking for a presentation and a quote to use in a presentation. It was a presentation to an American Library Association, and someone in this quote said, "I live in a library, Harry Houdini." And I thought, wait, what? What do you mean? What do you mean, Harry? Oh yeah, there was that weird thing at the Library of Congress. What was that? And then I went nuts for the fact that Houdini had a book collection, and not a lot of people knew about it. He was very much into it himself. Not only books, but playbills, theater. That collection is massive. It is held half at the Library, not some at the Library of Congress, and then the rest of it, the massive bulk of it, is at the University of Texas at Austin at the Ransom Center, who is doing a Houdini's Library exhibit starting this summer, which is really cool. And I just thought it was fascinating because I didn't really know that much about Harry Houdini besides like the Tony Curtis movie. And yeah, really, that's it. I had a little crush on Tony Curtis and the muscles and the dying in the tank thing. And, and then I found out that his whole life can basically be told in relation to the books.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and I
I'm
just thought it was a great message because the kid had maybe a second grade education.
Yeah, he's another character that just has fascinated me for so long because of not just what he accomplished, but the curiosity of this man
Right.
and coming from nothing. This is so easily a story where he would have just fallen off the radar, become, just
Tie cutter.
another,
He was a tie cutter, so he
yeah,
would have just cut ties till his fingers wore
yeah.
out, and that's that.
and uh and yet falls into this world or pursues this world. But also, like, it's a very kind of relatable story of the things you grew up with and lose, then kind of becomes your obsession and drives you, right? With his father.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. His dad was a rabbi, had a small book collection, but there were books in the house, and that was important to their family. They didn't have a lot else. They had an education. His dad had an education. Unfortunately, it's also a story of how the American dream takes a turn, but winds up working out in a different way. His father comes here and is like, all my sons are going to go to school. And, but the money, that they fall on hard times. And Houdini doesn't get much of an education and winds up, literally working in a sweatshop in New York. But this idea that reading and books is that's how you better yourself was just part of his DNA, legitimately part of his DNA. His dad has to sell his books. And so when Houdini has, a half of a Sunday morning off from the sweatshop, he goes to used bookstores and he runs across Houdin's, the famous French magician, Robert Houdin's autobiography and thinks, I want to be that guy. And then just starts buying old, and I mean old like 4 pennies, like covers falling off. We're not talking he had money, so like the junk that was, people were throwing in the recycle, the the 1900s version of the recycle bin was what Harry or Eric at the time was taking out and taking home and learning how to do card tricks and learning how to do coin tricks. And I'm going to turn myself into something. And he did. And the whole thing is like what I really thought was great about him is that curiosity you said too. He never lost that even famous. I mean, Houdini was arguably again one of the most famous people on the planet, and arguably name recognition wise, he still is.
Mm.
I mean, he still is. You can say that name. Obviously, there's still popular songs with that name. I mean, everybody knows what Houdini is or what that means, and he still kept learning. He wanted to learn more from other magicians and more from theater people and tell me your story. I mean, Houdini was a phenomenal story in and of himself. He was also a phenomenal collector of story. And I just thought there's nothing better to show young people is that no matter where you come from, the answer can be in information. The answer can be in reading. You can educate yourself. You don't need other people really.
And I think it would be a disservice if I didn't ask you about your illustrator, your
Ah,
artist on this,
the
Mar Del Mar.
genius, the genius,
Yeah,
the genius of Mar Del Mar.
this the process on this, if you could speak to it a little bit on the illustrations, because this isn't just we're not talking about no offense to anyone that's doing artwork on their computer, but this is not that.
No, Mar, I think that the title page is probably the best one to see. Okay, so Mar Del Mar is an artist based in Spain, and she builds these sets. Remember dioramas back in elementary school? Well, Mar Del Mar is the best dioramist you've ever seen or heard of. She builds, there are hundreds of little books the size of my pinky fingernail that have been created. And then she builds the entire set. So like Houdini's house, there's a spread of Houdini's bookcase and his house that actually exists in real life. And then Mar photographs it almost to just blur the edges of where she's cut paper. It's kind of just to make it, believe it or not, make it look a little bit more illustrative. But what I really loved and what myself and the people at Knopf, the editor and the art director at Knopf, what we really wanted to do is to show that process to kids. Because sometimes the art, even though it's the primary part of a picture book, it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle and the telling when you tell a nonfiction story. But this art, kids had to know how this thing was done. I mean, it's astonishing. She is a magician herself, as
I
far as
was
I'm concerned.
I was really blown away when after I'd read the book, I get to the back and when you get the illustrator's notes, and that's when I saw that Mar had constructed all of these sets. It is
Right.
incredible. All right, well, have you have you received any of the sets as a gift that
No, I
you
have
know?
not, but I did get an email just a couple of days ago from somebody from a magic convention that wants to ship them over and display them.
Oh, cool.
So I don't know if that's in process or not in process. That's Mars' decision and the publishers, but I would love to see them. I'm not sure they can be shipped from Spain. I'm not quite sure if they would make it in one piece.
I think,
But talk about hand-eye coordination. You know what I
yeah.
mean? I mean, I was like, wow, you gave Houdini a run for his money. I don't, you know, I don't.
I hope you end up with that, well, at least one of these in your office.
I would love it. I would
The
love it.
I was just thinking, I mean, with Houdini, when his father passed away, his mother wanted to make contact with him, was so desperate to believe, and Houdini's much of his life, especially once he had gained celebrity attention, was wrapped up between the illusionist act with Scientific American and debunking these mediums. And there's stories that when his father passed, they went to a medium. She traded the father's watch in order to contact spirit, and even then, young Harry was like, "This is BS." And then, interestingly, later on, when he's doing the circuit at carnivals or traveling road shows, he even presents himself as
Yes.
a fortune teller of sorts. But he had just been gaining gossip from around town and going to cemeteries.
Right.
And
Right.
then we get to the point where he is attending seances, sometimes dressed as, to look like an old lady just to catch people in the act. Right? But so much of him was wrapped up in this, and I do believe that he wanted to believe in the afterlife.
Absolutely.
So with all of that as a buildup, like he would have been about like 17, 18 years old, I guess. Uh, at the time that the Fox sisters would have passed away. So he
Oh,
existed
yeah, I guess so.
alongside them, in the
Uh,
same world before he gained really attention, but he
yeah.
would have seen some of these headlines and everything. I was just kind of curious.
Yeah.
Have you thought about them existing in that same world at
Wow,
the same time?
no. You just paranormaled my mind. No, I did not. But it's absolutely right, especially like when Houdini was running around picking up his used books was right around the same time.
And in New
Um,
York City, crossing
in New
over
York
quite a bit.
City too. Yeah, yeah. I don't really know if that legend about his father and the watch and everything, for some reason, I think I heard that and then heard someone. I don't know if you know who John Cox is, but he's a big Houdini. He runs a Houdini blog,
Yeah.
Wild About Harry. That's really, really great. And I think John told me that that might not be true, but
Maybe it's just apocryphal, but
because I wasn't in the spiritual world of Houdini doing this. I was in his book world. It was
yeah.
a different thing. But yeah, they were together. That's amazing. I had no idea. I should have had an idea, but I didn't have an idea.
I mean, who know? I mean, who knows? I mean, like the the desire to debunk the mediums did not emerge simply because he did the seances with Arthur Conan Doyle,
Right.
but the interest was already there, and
And I wonder if it's because, like, the confession, Maggie, the Fox sisters' confession, the fact that they had kind of debunked themselves was probably or could have easily been what Houdini heard first
yeah,
about them. He wasn't there when the initial huge burst of belief, before and right into the Civil War. He wasn't there. I mean, he wasn't born then. He was born as it kind of did a wane and then did another buildup around World War One.
yeah,
And as people lost people, then it was like, oh, I really want to talk, of course, which is Conan Doyle's story that he lost a son in World War One, and that became part of his,
yeah.
search
The
for spirit, through spiritualism, was to contact his son. So yeah, I wonder if Houdini kind of started out a debunker because that's the first thing he ever heard about mediums was that they were fake.
I think he believed. I think or wanted to believe.
I think he
I,
wanted to believe and wanted to make it happen.
yeah,
And and
because
I
the
don't know.
the confession by Maggie was 1888, right? Like
Right.
is when it was
Yeah.
published.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about these worlds that these both exist in, and the fact that I forget exactly where everybody was at any given time, but the fact that all three of the sisters are buried in New York City. Houdini was active
Yes.
in New York City. I forget what age that he ended up in New York from Appleton,
About
Wisconsin.
17. About
Yeah, so
17.
like
16, 17. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
one just must have this is me just sort of fan casting that
Yeah.
movie of like
Yeah.
them Forrest Gumping into one another on the
That's
street,
right.
or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
it,
as Maggie's like drunk in the street and she runs over the little Houdini, she trips over Eric Weiss
yeah.
coming down the street from the tie factory or something. I don't
Well,
know.
before I let you go, let me ask, like, with the Fox sisters, I mean, obviously the fascination with the paranormal long preceded them, even though
Yes.
what took place was so significant that I think we're still very much living in the wake of what the Fox sisters created. And when you look at paranormal TV shows or you look at how people talk about the paranormal, in a lot of ways we're still kind of like echoing those early seances to some degree. And spiritualism itself, as you said, it had like another renewed element, kind of movement in the wake of World War One or during World War One, and then leapt the ponds. And I think like we keep coming back to it after these moments of great loss and whatnot, and it changes each time. But
Yeah.
what do you ascribe the fact that these three girls very much launched this belief system, this philosophy that then continued on and I think continues on in some form or fashion, like even after saying, at least two of them, that like, we were goofing. To what do you ascribe that legacy?
Humans need to believe. I mean, I don't, I mean, someone said to me, oh, they couldn't have invented the seances. People have been talking to dead for forever. And I'm like, well, that is true. There has never been, I don't think that there has ever been a culture that we know of where that, or the Oracle of Delphi, all of that, you know what I mean? Yes, of course. But I think they gave it a shape. That's what I think it is. They gave it a shape. They gave it a shape and they brought it into your house. And that was very powerful, right? I mean, before you had to go to like the temple or the oracle or the whatever, or the king or the king's court and ask them a big important question. What the Fox sisters did was take some of the ideas that have been floating around forever and some of the desires because we miss people when they're gone, and we want to talk to them again. We want that communication, and they gave it a shape, and they put a candle in the middle of the table, and they gave it a community. Let's all hold hands, you know, and then you sang songs together. I mean, that all, when you think about that, as opposed to having it go out and having to go to some big important guy, you brought it in. They brought it in, and I think that is part of it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, I don't. I still don't feel like an expert. The topic is just huge when you really kind of go to all the threads. But I think they gave it a shape and they brought it home, and that's kind of where it belonged. That's where people died. That's where people
Yeah.
live, and that's where people die. And
Yeah. I
yeah,
I I
I
think
mean,
go on, sorry.
no, I have nothing else to say. I mean, I really don't. I don't know. I don't have an answer. I have thoughts. You
Yeah.
know.
It's yeah, I mean as you said, like as opposed to organized r religion which has these ordained men in charge and they're the boss. You now have these three women that are, you know, viewed as somewhat, simple, plain women, girls, really, but they're tapping into something immensely important in the home.
Mhm.
Very, yeah, like it's almost like the perception of the simplicity of it and
Right.
it makes it carry on. I don't know, but
Right. It makes it more true. I mean, I think it made it easier um to feel something. I mean, I think it made it more emotional. I mean, you're in a closed room, you're together, you're singing, you're holding hands. I mean, it's a community, and when it worked, and you can say whatever that meant. I mean, when people they felt really great comfort. I think with oracles and with priests and whoever, and I don't mean priest like a specific religion. I just mean in general, that it's usually for like power, like should we go to war, right? This was like, I miss my grandma. Can my
mhm.
grandma come and talk to me? And those are all that it's a much more emotional, they brought a much more feminine, I mean, to use a stereotypical, maybe feminine energy to the whole idea too. You
Yeah,
know, I
immensely
mean, they
important
did.
women. Like, I
Right,
mean, however one views them, they did something. And let's face it, most of the spiritualist movement coming out of that was dominated by these women mediums.
right,
So
right,
they immensely important,
right,
however we view what they did.
right, right.
Uh, two quick questions.
Yeah.
One, do you have any spooky stories or anything that maybe moved you in the category of like maybe I
Yes,
need
well,
to.
the book kind of stuff. I mean, the whatever. I mean, this is an interesting story. My grandfather is someone I loved very much, and my family is a group of skeptics. You've never seen a bigger capital S skeptical group in your life, right? So we don't. I went to a lot of Catholic school, but besides, the religious side of things, we were skeptics. And I was in my 40s. My grandfather died in my 20s. He still was one of the most important people, probably the most important reason that I am a writer. Um, Loved him. Didn't really think that much about it. Certainly didn't think I heard him or saw him or any of that. But I was at a birthday party with a very kind of casual, oh, we have a medium, like a birthday party medium. Nobody that interesting. And sat across from the woman. And right away she says, oh, I see an older man in the room. And, skeptical me is like, of course, because I'm 40 years old. Like, who else would be dead in my life? I mean, odds are it would be somebody who's older. And I'm just thinking this. I'm giving her nothing. I mean, I know, I'm Miss Stoic. And she says it's begins with an S. My grandfather's name did begin with an S, but I did not tell her that. And I was like, huh. And she says, it's not Sam, but it's like that. It sounds like Sam. I can't think of the name. It sounds like Sam. My grandfather's name was Stan. I did not tell her that. And then she says, and then she went on to say what I would consider a lot of very generic reading. He's watching out for you and he's happy where he is. And, the things we want to know and that felt very comforting, but weren't particularly specific. And then she looked right at me and she goes, I'm getting the strangest feeling. I'm going to say something now and it's probably wrong. Um, but why is his face two different colors? And I'm telling you, Aaron, I almost like, I don't even know. I did not say anything to this woman, but in my head, I went, oh my God, Grandpa. My grandfather had vitiligo. He was Armenian, very dark skin. And his vitiligo took the shape of this half of his face was very pale. And this half of his face was very dark. And I just thought it was such a specific read. Like, no one is going to cold or hot read that out of nowhere because what are the odds that anyone else has a grandfather with a two-face? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it struck me. I was just struck by it. And I remember thinking, holy, okay. And I left the room and I was a little like shook, but shook in a good way. Like, all right. But that's probably my spookiest story. I mean, I don't even know if that's spooky. It was comforting. It was spirit. I feel like, I don't know. This woman was at a birthday party. She didn't get paid that much. I don't think she was the world's greatest medium or anything, but it struck me. So, and what's the second question? Since that was number one, I'm sorry, that
Oh,
was a long answer.
no, it's a great answer. I think it counts as spooky. What are your other upcoming projects that we should keep an eye out for?
I have a couple of books coming out of picture books. Um, let's see. One called Katie Listened about a scientist named Kate Payne who discovered how whales sing. She was the whale singing woman. I am also kind of obsessed. I might have a new American Spirits burrowing. I'm kind of and I know everyone's heard about these, but the whole medical grave robber thing,
Hmm.
that whole thing in Johns Hopkins has really got me like really interested. So we'll see what happens with that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I again, I truly loved American Spirits, and I would
Thank
say
you so much.
I know it was, the target audience is a younger audience, but maybe because of that, I think, I don't know. It's such a great presentation of this story, and it includes so much details that I think, and so much clearly just a momentous amount of research has gone into this book, and it's very obvious, and it's just laid out so expertly that I really appreciate it. I happen to really enjoy the author's note just because I was trying to get into your head with it, and I don't feel like I did, and I want to talk to you like 5 years from now and see from this author's note where you're at with it, because it seems like there's a person that's kind of grappling with this mystery a little bit uh,
Yeah.
and how strange it is. But
Yep.
Barb, I just truly appreciate your time. And for everybody out there, whether you're watching this, whether you're a part of the live stream or listening to the audio podcast, the book is American Spirits, The Famous Fox Sisters, and the Mysterious Fad That Haunted the Nation. And I don't know why my haunted a nation, my screen is a little fuzzy there. And the other book is Houdini's Library, which is just a joy and gorgeous and a fun story about one of my favorite people in history is Harry Houdini. So, Barb, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Aaron.
All right. Guys, this has been Talking Strange. I'm Aaron Sagers, and until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.